Well, Professor Justin Bronk, Senior Research Fellow for Air Power and Technology in the Military Science section of the Royal United Services Institute. Delighted you could join us for this latest edition of In Defence. We're looking at the Strategic Defence Review choices available to the government, but of course, with your background, we're going to focus on air power particularly today. Justin, very warm welcome to you, firstly.
Thanks for having me on.
Hey, you're welcome. Let's get straight into it. We were talking earlier. One of the challenges at the moment is that the defence review. We've still got defence secretary talking about defence reforms and efficiencies. In other words, the classic language of defence, where it feels like this is a once in a generational challenge for defence. It's the Cold War ended. We've had 35 years of wars of choice, not wars of national survival, and it feels like a desperate need to reconfigure. And that's where I think I'm going to explore a little bit with you today. One of the conversations that when I'm listening to your views on some of this, you talk about the RAF being well capitalized, but maybe not having their numbers. Can I just first question for you really is that we do have quite a lot of what some would call exquisite capability in the military, but there is an argument that quantity has a quality all of its own. Do you think this new world order, there is a place for the sort of strike master-esque equivalent in this modern air force? So we can augment the quality with some quantity.
So I think there's absolutely a requirement for mixing the sort of traditional, fairly exquisite, or indeed new, very exquisite approaches with essentially air-launched or very long-range ground-launched effects. Think Argon or Storm Shadow or Meteor, with something that you can produce in quantity and field in quantity for a lower price point. Most of the operational analysis that I've seen suggests that it isn't one or the other. You need both, because what that mass does in terms of, hypothetically, in a hypothetical example, you might have several hundred decoy / one-way attacks, low end one-way attack systems, plus some kind of things that have some EW capabilities that are at the lower end, but that you can have quite a few of and a single use. That is very, very effective at soaking up channels of fire available to, let's say, the Russian air defense network, and potentially wasting quite a bit of their ammunition, which is great. But it doesn't get you to a sustainable degradation of that air defense network in itself. It needs to be opening the door temporarily, and you typically be looking at some very, very short windows that you might get by using those kind of capabilities to actually kill the key targets within that air defense network, so particularly radars and things. So you need that mix. And where I think the RAF is okay at the moment, obviously it would be great to have more combat assets. The big thing that's missing, or the biggest thing that's missing, I think, is basically lethality in terms of effectors and an ability to put some of that stand-in, particularly electronic attack and decoy mass to enable weapons to get through.
Yeah, I was thinking particularly that when I did 3 tours in Afghanistan, and admittedly a completely different sort of conflict, but we were sending, daily waves and waves of incredibly expensive capable aeroplanes to do jobs that could have been done by a lot lower end. And you and I both know that to kick the door down day one, you need to have a high end capability, but you don't necessarily need that throughout the course of a conflict. And it just feels at the moment in a stark choice. I mean, clearly everybody would have lots of Starship Enterprises if we could afford it. But the reality is, you're always going to be financially limited. And I just wondered whether, in the discussions that you're having, we've got to look at this as a war of national survival. It isn't just high end, because that could get incredibly expensive, but also unrealistic.
Possibly, but I mean, it's interesting if you look at what the Ukrainians have managed, but also not managed, with trying to develop, and in many cases successfully developing and fielding, with assistance as well from ourselves and other partners, answers to how to tackle those problem sets without the exquisite. And frankly, I don't think we want to fight like that, because it's pretty indecisive. It ends up being very attritional. And actually, if for each effect that you want to have with, you know, a load of massed one-way attack capabilities, for example, if each of those capabilities is pretty affordable, $25 to $40,000, let's say, for something that's going, several hundred to, maybe over 1,000 kilometers with a one-way payload, but you fire 100 plus of them at once, which is a completely standard thing these days in Ukraine. I mean, Russia's firing hundreds of Shaheds at once going the other way, and it's, they're anywhere from about 40 to about $130,000 each, depending on what kind of modules and things they have. Actually, at that point, your cost per wave, as it were, is enormous, and the effects are not decisive in any way. So you're having to sustain that. I actually don't think, if you math that out, that that approach is much cheaper than what I think is probably the route forward, which is leveraging those sort of technologies to a sufficient degree to enable our more exquisite stuff to get through. Apart from anything else, the threats that we're looking at are so proximate, they're so close in time, especially with the developments since the Trump administration really got its feet under the table. We're going to have to, if we have to fight, we're going to have to fight with what we've got. And what we've got is quite a lot of, particularly in the air domain, fantastic platforms without many weapons. So trying to solve that lethality area and thereby radically increase the latent capability that is there, but isn't currently usable, I think is probably better and quicker than trying to reinvent the wheel completely, if that makes sense.
I absolutely take the point. One of the things that we have focused a lot on platforms rather than weapons, I suspect, over the last few years. And there's some areas, particularly like seed and deed, which we'll get into in a minute. I do wonder whether, what we've seen in Ukraine, President Zelensky was desperately keen to get hold of platforms, F-16s and latterly Mirage 2000s. They don't seem to have had much effect at the moment, largely because they haven't got the aircrew to fly them, and there is a question about what weapons they've got. First, point is, do you see air power being decisive in the war in Ukraine, given that Zelensky's now got some fighters? And the second part of the question is, why are the 2000s in there? Why are the Mirage 2000s arrived? It seems to me it's just complicating an already difficult picture. Is that purely political, or do you think that's got some military application?
So I don't think you will see air power having any sort of decisive effect on the Ukrainian side. The deliveries of fighters help from an air defense point of view, particularly F-16s, and the ability to deliver precision strikes when, air defense laydown and EW conditions kind of allow it, with glide bombs and such. But their main purpose is to enable the Ukrainian Air Force to survive as a defensive entity over the medium term, because they simply can't keep running on their MiG-29s, Sukhoi 27s, and Sukhoi 24s, because they keep losing them over time. This is an attritional war. They've done amazingly well to keep them going as long as they have, but they do keep losing them, and will keep losing them. And frankly, a lot of their domestic capacity to support those aircraft with sort of, medium-term overhaul type work was destroyed early on in the war in Russian strikes. And the manufacturers are in a hostile country. So they have to transition to Western aeroplanes. And so in that sense, that's kind of where I see more of the value of the F-16s. The Mirage 2000s are an interesting one. I think it probably was more politically motivated as a donation up front when it was announced. And certainly from an air defense point of view, they have the same limitations, but more so than F-16 does in terms of the limitations of the radar, and particularly the effective range of their air-to-air missile, which they're limited to Mica, which is sort of shorter range than a Charlie model AMRAAM, keeping it in vague terms. So it certainly doesn't solve the main deficit from an air defense point of view that the F-16s with AMRAAM have, which is getting close enough to have a reasonable chance at a shot at, with any sort of reasonable probability of kill, against a Russian glide bomb attack or fighter cap that is significant distances on the Russian side of the lines within that ground-based air defense laydown and the simultaneous fighter and AWACS threat. So Mirage doesn't really help there either. And you're right that it is a significant complication in terms of an additional logistics, training, basing challenge. I suspect that where they will find utility most would be if they're able to be adapted to launch Storm Shadow and Scalp. Because as the F-16s are primarily intended to replace the MiG-29 and Sukhoi-27, the Sukhoi-24 fleet wasn't huge at the start of the war, and they've been incredibly heavily utilized. And Storm Shadow and Scalp remain a very important part of the Ukrainian arsenal. So given that I believe Mirage 2000-9s in service with the UAE were adapted to carry Black Shaheen, which was their version of Storm Shadow Scalp missile, I suspect that at least the separation and carriage trials have, data is all already there for the older model Dash 5s that or Charlies that are going across. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what you see their primary utility as over time is as a cruise missile launch platform, obviously within the capacity to contribute to cruise missile and Shahed defense internally.
Yeah, much as it would be tempting for me to dive deeply into the Ukraine thing, I'm going to drag you back out to our sort of SDR look. You talked about weapons, and I think the danger is we often get seduced by platforms, whereas actually the effectors that matter. If you look at our SDR priorities, you and I have talked before. Let's look at the two tips of the sword, the Typhoon and the Joint Strike Fighter, starting with Typhoon first. It still doesn't have an E-scan radar. When I left the military, it was just about to arrive. Where should we invest in Typhoon? Is it the E-scan radar? Are there certain weapons? I'm thinking particularly in C, D, and other such capabilities. Where do you see us getting the best bang for our buck out of our investment in Typhoon?
So I think there's a pretty strong argument to be made for increasing the number of E-scan radar sets, the ECRS Mark II or Radar Mark II, which we're buying to basically retrofit them and ideally speed up the time frame significantly for retrofit work onto the 77 Tranche 2 Typhoons that form the bulk of the fleet. At the moment, the only thing funded is the 40 Tranche 3s. Yes, it would be expensive, but first of all, the radar is by far the weakest part of Typhoon, and it has been for quite a while. So the capability uplift there, particularly given how aggressive the specification was for Mark II, which is why it's taken so long. It is a very, very capable multi-mission radar that would transform the capability of the jet to not only engage targets and generate SA, but also, for example, electronic countermeasures, so self-defense capacity. The problem is, being British in classic fashion, we've specified a fairly world-leading capability, which as a result has taken an incredibly long time to develop and been vastly expensive. And then we have bought so few of them that the cost per radar, if you work out the program cost across 40 radar sets, I think it works out to about 50, slightly over 50 million pounds per radar, which, given that an F-35A, which comes with a more capable radar in most ways, today would cost you about 75 million pounds, is not, I mean, yes, you would then have to operate it and all the rest. I understand, but it's pretty difficult to look at that Mark II program and not go, this is an astonishingly high cost for the number of sets that will eventually be on the front line. So, given that almost all the development work has already been done and it is now finally flying on RAF-owned Typhoons, seen it, it's good to see, and it would be a huge increase on the jet. It would seem obvious as a route to double down there.
It's
And
also,
then
but it's also, I mean, I think I take your point, but I mean, it's a bit like if you only were developing one car, the whole development cost a bloody fortune. It's all on one car. There are a number of customers for Typhoon. I think most of them would want to have a capable E-scan radar. There's clearly export opportunities if the capability is proven. And of course, once you've got it proven, then potentially it can be leveraged. I'm also thinking, though, in terms of weapons sets. I'm old enough and grey enough that we were obviously very worried about enemy radars, and therefore, the suppression of enemy air defenses and killing enemy air defenses was a key role, not something that the Royal Air Force are really focused on. Do you think that's an area we should be investing more heavily in?
I mean, undoubtedly, we have really dropped the ball on SEAD and DEAD because it is our primary determinants of success in any air engagement against Russian forces. Russian forces rely primarily on ground-based air defenses in huge quantities, well, pretty significant quantities, densely layered, mobile, and they require specific specialized weapons and other layered effects to go after, which we simply don't have in quantity or in many cases at all. It is a scandal, frankly, that our F-35Bs, A, that there's so few of them at this point, but B, that their only air-to-ground weapon is a Paveway 4, which is a free-fall bomb for a fifth-gen fighter supposed to go into defended airspace, which, without getting into any classified details on vulnerability or rear threat ranges, suffice it to say, in that sort of threat environment, an F-35 is not going to get close enough to drop a free-fall bomb to those kind of threats. It's again an example of where attempts to maintain a given frontline strength of platforms, which in the F-35 case has also failed because the fleet was never supposed to be this small at this point, have obscured, on a budget that just wasn't adequate, have led to a complete hollowing out of the capabilities as a whole, particularly weapons in this case. For Typhoon, I mean, I suspect we've missed the boat on ordering a load more AMRAAM. It's a lot of countries have ordered more AMRAAM, plus Ukraine has obviously been receiving priority since midway through last year for production. But for example, Japan just ordered up to 1,200 AMRAAMs. So, basically, if we were looking to buy more AMRAAM, the development time, the delivery timescales are probably into the 2030s at this point. It's too late for that. The only other option for long-range stick for Typhoon, which in any Russia context it would need, because the standoff ranges it would need to be engaging from are quite significant, would be Meteor. Bluntly, this is an area where MBDA have just conspicuously failed to work with, and I'm sure there's fault on both sides, the government and MBDA, but the fact that capacity to produce has not increased, and that, I know the UK has also dragged its feet. There's quite a lot of intricacy here, but it is notable that because of recent German orders for Meteor, which is good to see, it's also on current trend will be a pretty long time before we get new stocks of Meteor if we bought more. And it's such a, I would suggest, failure to read the market by MBDA themselves as well to not invest in significant additional production capacity, given how completely oversubscribed AMRAAM is and how desperate the sort of global context has been clearly trending towards, over the last 3 years. This, yes, the period since Trump took office has been an incredibly rapid degradation in the security environment in ways that are not just unexpectedly quick, but just impossible to predict because of how colossally stupid they are. But at the same time, the direction of travel has been clear for years. And so, we would want for Typhoon, I'm sure, a bunch more Meteor, particularly, as well as, of course, maintaining ASRAAM stocks to do that defense of the UK role against cruise missiles, which the Russians would potentially launch from bombers up in the Arctic. You'd also really want more than 3 E-7s for that, because one of your primary challenges, if you're relying on fighters, as we would, primarily as your defense against cruise missile salvos, is that those cruise missiles can take, it'd be large salvos potentially from bombers up in the Arctic. They have the range to take some pretty convoluted routes to targets, and they're relatively low signature in terms of radar cross-section and heat signature. And they also fly quite low over the sea, which produces some interesting radar returns. So the efficiency of the fighters that you can put up will be dictated by not just weapon loadout. Obviously, ASRAAM stocks and potentially other things are important, but it's how rapidly and accurately C2 is able to vector those fighters into each sort of group of missiles as they do distance. So 3 E-7s, you're not necessarily going to be able to guarantee even one on orbit medium term with 3. There was a reason the requirement was 5.
Yeah, no, I'll get on to the E-7 stuff. If I just bring you back, so that's Typhoon. You talked a lot about the Joint Strike Fighter, B variant, A variant, and there's a massive complexity here. But in principle, this was a lot about carrier strike, because the B variant can take off and land off the carrier, which without cats and traps you couldn't do. It feels like that the fundamental premise of why we got carrier strike was all about expeditionary warfare has been removed. And yet the big thing that does seem to be emerging from the defense review is a bigger focus on anti-submarine warfare. Now, all of that would tend to imply, don't want to get into the carrier debate, but if you wanted to have more mass and more capability, you'd probably be choosing the A model Joint Strike Fighter rather than the B model. Do you think this is a shift? We're going to see a shift away from carrier-based aviation apart from anti-submarine warfare, and more a shift towards increasing our orders of hopefully the A model, which will give us a much more bang for our buck, more range, and certainly a cheaper variant than the B?
Well, I mean, so the biggest issue with the current focus on carrier strike for the B models is, bluntly, the Royal Navy does not have the personnel or the munitions funding or the dockside infrastructure or the frigate replacement program pipeline to provide adequate defense for the carriers against any opponent that would require an F-35 to go and operate against. If you look at what, for example, the threat laydown might look like if you wanted to put the carrier or one of the carriers in the Red Sea and operate F-35B against the Houthis, as the Italians briefly went through, I would suggest that you would probably run into pretty significant risk levels and certainly require all the output from the Type 45 fleet that's there, and munitions would get interesting quickly. Well, that's against a proxy force supported by Iran, and therefore the proposition either in the Indo-Pacific or Europe that the carrier strike group would be the core of the way you would want to operate F-35B against Chinese or Russian forces. I just don't see a way that you would ever take the risk of putting them on the ship, because we don't have the capacity to defend it. Yes, it's harder to hit a ship or find and target a ship than an airfield, of course, but airfields don't sink when you hit them, and airfields are mostly grass and concrete. And airfields do things like keep the planes, the munitions, and the fuel separately and quite a significant distance apart, whereas a carrier has to have them essentially all in center mass in a metal box. In other words, unless you think that it is more of a risk to have aircraft moving around all the literally tens and tens of bases, of concrete bases in Europe, that we could use for F-35s. And by the way, there's a lot of F-35 infrastructure now in Europe because a lot of F-35 operators. Unless you think that is riskier than gambling that we can prevent a single hit on the carrier against Russian submarines, backfires, there's quite a lot of anti-ship capability that Russia could put up. So yeah, I'm not sure that in most of those NATO contexts we would probably end up taking that risk, partly because at the sort of ranges you would want to put the carrier, you would then need organic tanker support, of which we're also critically short. Most of the countries that have looked at how to operate forces sustainably against Russia within weapons envelope tend to default to, as the Swedes and the Finns do, and the Norwegians, multiple dispersal bases where you can quickly land, hot pit and refuel, and potentially rearm if you need to, and then go in and then come back and go to a load of other bases, which are all over Europe. Again, I mean, it's not necessarily to say you couldn't get the carrier task group to a point where it could defend itself, but you would require a lot of investment to do that, particularly in air defense missiles, which, as we know, are famously expensive, whether that's CAM or Aster 30. Potentially something even bigger in the Mark 41 BLSs in Type 45. But again, you're talking huge amounts of investment. The A model of the F-35 it's significantly cheaper to buy. It's massively cheaper to operate, and is getting more. The disparity in operating costs is getting greater over time, not lesser, because there is so much better predictive maintenance data for the F-35As because there are so many more globally that fly so much more than the Bs, which is a tiny fleet and doesn't fly as much. So over time, the accuracy of that predictive maintenance data is just getting better and better relatively for the A's versus the B's. So the maintenance is getting cheaper. But yeah, the A is cheaper to operate, cheaper to buy, much more capable as an aeroplane, but can't operate with the carriers. I think, to be honest, we're probably nearly past this debate though, because the threats are so close that ordering new F-35s at this point, yeah, yes, we kind of need to continue to try and build out the fleet um, as a medium-term threat hedge, but they're not going to arrive in time to solve any of the immediate problems. So then you're back to weapons.
No. And I think that there is a timing thing here. You're absolutely right. The near term, medium term, and long term. I think, given the time we have available, it's more looking at what has changed the environment. And I think, having looked at the jets, I mean, if we look at some of the enablers and the support platforms now, the danger is we talk about platforms rather than capabilities. But I have to say, in the time available, we've talked a little bit. There seems to be a rising recognition that anti-submarine warfare is going to be a key issue in the future, and therefore P8 is a crucial. We used to have Nimrods doing this all the time. I used to know a lot of fellows who it took a long time to be good at that sort of stuff, and we've sort of walked away from it. Do you see that as a big focus for the future in a sort of post defense review world? And do you think Poseidon is the answer to that question?
Well, certainly, I would say I think the P8 force is actually one of the bits of the RAF that's looking healthiest. They they're operating new aeroplanes that are genuinely fantastic at what they do. They're part of global user community, particularly US, but also Norway as well, and obviously Australia and a bunch of other allies that operate them or are going to operate them. It's a fantastic platform. It's relatively easy to support. The mission systems are cutting edge and have had some significant British input in terms of basically IP from the Nimrod program. And actually, all their facilities are brand new, and it's a force that feels fairly happy and capable when you go and spend time with them. Obviously, it would be nice to have more airplanes, although it's very expensive. I think the problem with discussing what those limitations are in terms of 9 versus the original 14 requirement is that you run into very classified stuff very quickly. I would say, as an overall thing, that the P8 force is, I suspect, not where you would see immediate uplift. I think if there was uplift for how do we fill in gaps relative to particularly European and UK within European defense options against Russia, if you were looking at anything in the ISTAR force, you'd be looking at E7 before you looked at P8.
So looking at E7, is that Wedgetail? Because that's the next one. You mentioned it earlier. There's always a need for that sort of capability in the skies, and I think we've got 3. Is it? I think we've got
3 on order, and
yeah.
the first one is flying now.
Yeah, and we're into an area now where there is a debate about how much should we have nationally versus how much should we rely on NATO, Europe, coalition type stuff. Because do we want to have all the pieces of the chessboard owned nationally, or do we need to be part of a bigger force? We used to be part of the NATO AWACS force and stuff like that. Where do you see that going in this slightly more dangerous world?
I think on E7, we're likely to keep a fairly strong view on that being maintained nationally, although, of course, we do have an ambition to go back to fulfilling the NATO AWACS commitment, which we used to meet with Sentry, so E3D. But I think the reason why we're likely to keep mostly E7 as a national focus rather than something that's towed to NATO for most of the time is because of its centrality as the key airborne sensor for missile defense of the UK and the bases in the UK. Because the radar is much more capable than the E3 radar. particularly against relatively small, low RCS targets like KH-101 cruise missiles, which would be our primary threat vector. And unlike a fighter radar, you can sweep a really pretty large area and get very, very high resolution returns, even at pretty long distances. So as a force multiplier for UK air and missile defense, specifically of the homeland, and all the bases there, including American bases, I think it's so central that it's probably one that we would only look to get more involved with the sort of pooling NATO type approach if it involved a significant uplift in the number of aircraft to the point where we could potentially service 2 orbits instead of 1. If it's 1 orbit, yeah, it's probably going to be nationally focused for the most part.
But well, I'm fascinated that I wasn't expecting that response, because I mean we've got Findales as well and other ways of looking for missiles coming in. If that genuinely was something that because in my personal view, there's a massive capability gap at the moment in terms of our ability to protect from missile attack. When I was doing flying training just down the road at Boston Heath, we used to have Bloodhound missile systems sat there. None of that exists today. So we've got some of the radars and the warning, but we don't have the effectors to actually bring stuff down. Therefore, I absolutely with you. I think a critical role that we need to plug the gap on is missile defense, but sensing is one thing. Having effectors that can do something about it is quite another. What's going to plug that gap?
Well, the main answer is Typhoon with ASRAAM. Ultimately, one of the core requirements for not just Typhoon, but interestingly GCAP, is that not just QRA in peacetime, but that air and missile defense in wartime. So, it very much is going up and shooting down cruise missiles, which, it's interesting to note that as far as I'm aware, the Typhoons, RAF Typhoons taking part in that multinational defense against that Iranian attack into Israel in April last year, I believe the RAF Typhoons were the only things to shoot down any of the incoming cruise missiles and/or Shahed type drones that did not have an AESA radar. Because the French Rafales operating probably ones with AESAs, because that's probably what they put out there. The bulk of the shoot downs were US Air Force F-15 Echoes with the new AESA radar on there. Israeli aircraft, don't know. But
that was a really good example for me, is that massive wave of attack. My knowledge was there were 2 Typhoons involved in that. Now, you could argue, was that more political than it was military? Were we more focused on GI because we didn't have the ESA? If we're talking about defense of the nation, modern parlance is you try and deluge the defenses, swamp them. Well, having a couple of Typhoons on queue with a few missiles on board, it doesn't feel that it's going to be anything close to being a robust defense of our nation.
It's certainly not a full answer, but remembering that we would likely have quite a bit of warning that at least sufficient to arm up aeroplanes and get them on standby. Also, we would be operating alongside particularly the Finns, Swedes, and Norwegians because of where the Russians tend to go. And then again, it comes back to how much can you multiply the ability of a number of jets with a number of missiles to attrit those waves of things coming in, because while the Russian while the Russian arsenal might be thousands of long-range missiles by that point, and it's already above 1,000, although they're firing most of what they produce at the moment into Ukraine, that would obviously stop if there's some sort of deal, at least temporarily. But that's again why that airborne sensor piece with E7 is so critical, because you must, for that to have a significant chunking effect of the salvo weight which the Russians could actually practically achieve. They won't be able to sortie every bomber they have. Even with the number of bombers they're likely to be able to sortie with a maximum effort, you're looking at probably somewhere between about 300 and 400 missiles at most, at which point they're not just going to be firing at the UK, because if they're firing into Europe, they must assume that we would then start trying to go after the bombers on their way back and also potentially on their bases, trying to get rid of all the various bits of that chain that allows them to operate, because then they're legitimate targets. It's also part of their nuclear arsenal. So until they start to be used, they're probably unlikely to be targeted. So in other words, there's a cost to the Russians, and reloads are not necessarily something they can count on at the same scale. So they would have to be looking at a payoff that justifies that risk in terms of targeting. And 300 to 400 missiles sounds like a lot, but if you spread that number of DPIs, designated points of impact, across all the different bases that they would need to target in all the different European countries, even if the US is staying out of it, to generate a sufficient effect to make it worth that huge escalation and the likely response, at least the response they'd have to plan on. Actually, the effect on any individual base, unless it's all concentrated on one, in which case, yes, wipe something off the face of the earth. You end up at a point where even attrition of 50%, even of that wave, starts being a serious chunk out of it. And then the probability of kill on impact is not going to be zero. There are other nations that do have ground-based air defenses. And obviously, the UK would be much better off if particularly key bases like Lossiemouth, where all our MPAs and all of our AWACS are going to be based, and a bunch of our combat air had even a relatively limited amount of something like Sky Sabre. Because then if you're already attriting the missile salvos on their way in, having that effective point defense to significantly further attrit gets you down to potentially just a handful of impacts, even from a pretty dedicated salvo. At which point, it's probably not worth it for the Russians to take the risk against their fleet that would then start being engaged. So I think it's doable. Too often we look at air defense or missile defense as something that has to be this impenetrable shield. It's never been what any successful air defense has been based on. Successful air defense is based on the idea of slowing attacks down and reducing their effectiveness to a point that you gain time and space to have other effects. In the Russian case, that's to have effects with their land forces. In our case, at least traditionally within NATO, that would be to give us time to break down the Russian air defense network to a point where we can start going after their launchers, their storage facilities, their C2. In other words, start deconstructing their campaign.
I agree, except for the fact that what we're talking about here, and you touched on it earlier, is that we used to have in the Cold War a lot of redundancy to allow ourselves that if they weren't be quite sure where our platforms were, and therefore you would have that uncertainty. Today, all of our joint strike fighters are based on one base, and they are the tip of the sword. They are the most capable platform we have, and therefore, we don't have that redundancy. We're incredibly vulnerable. Redundancy costs you money, and therefore it's an investment choice. It feels like fundamentally that's one of the things that feels completely different today. This isn't about a defense review where you evolve and do some efficiencies. There's a different language, it feels to me, required, that rather than efficiencies, we're talking about we need redundancy. We need to have everything to be able to be deployed. Otherwise, you create a clear vulnerability, particularly when you've got exquisite platforms on really largely the tip of the sword on two main bases.
Yeah, I mean, the Royal Air Force and the Fleet Air Arm are fairly unusually vulnerable on their base in terms of their basing posture compared to even most other European nations. So if you look at our combat air platforms, for example, we've got 3 main operating bases, plus 2 regular dispersal ones, Akrotiri and Amari up in Estonia. But it's basically Coningsby, Lossiemouth, and Morum. None of them have any air defense. And if you compare that with, for example, even France, which is also a long way away from potential threats, they've got 6 main operating bases, plus also ones overseas, 3 of which have layered air defense. They all have hardened aircraft shelters for all the aeroplanes. And so, even just looking straight across, it's a better picture there. And what's really notable to me is that a lot of air forces that can't disperse in Europe are at least spending significant amounts of, well, I mean, it's not even huge amounts of money, but they're spending money to recondition Cold War hardened aircraft shelters, because actually hardened aircraft shelters are really useful. For a start, it gets rid of a lot of your drone problem. So if you're worried about threats, as you should be, threats to aircraft on the ground from everything from small, Spetsnaz or local idiot operated UAS through to Shahed type things. Well, none of those is getting through a hardened aircraft shelter that's closed. They can't carry a warhead big enough. So at a stroke, anything that's parked in a hardened aircraft shelter is safe from those kind of threats until you take it out. But also, Russian missiles have about a 50% probability of kill against hardened aircraft shelters in Ukraine. So going back to that point about it being a layered process to defend yourself, if it's about taking that number of missiles the Russians can put in and reducing the impact they think they can get to below where they think it's worth doing because of the risk that and the cost they'll run from doing it. And so if, let's say you were able to attract 40, 50% even only of them coming in, then another 20, 30% as they actually come in if you had a bit of terminal air defense, particularly Sky Sabre, which was literally, I know it's going for the army now, but it was literally designed to protect air bases because the Falklands Rapier replacement requirement is brilliant for defending air bases against cruise missiles. So given we're buying it anyway for the army, having an additional half battery at each of the main operating locations would seem like a fairly obvious, very high payoff thing to do. But if you start adding in hardened aircraft shelters for everything, which really don't cost that much, and where they are spending money, it's spending money with local construction firms, so it's going straight back into the economy. You would very rapidly then be also cutting what impacts they are having against aircraft, at least, stand-fast squadron buildings, in half again. And, you know, if you built more hardened aircraft shelters and reconditioned old ones and went back to, say, using the ones that are still at Lossiemouth, at Lucas, at Leeming, you're then having to make the Russians calculate that even for each hardened aircraft shelter that they do penetrate, there's a decent chance it'll be empty. And so, you know, again, you can actually do a lot with passive hardening. And at the moment, I think the RAF has probably made a bit of a misstep with this idea of focusing heavily on ACE because it became a kind of catch-all term, so agile combat employment. And, you know, they sort of sandwiched halfway between the American concept of agile combat employment, which involves bringing in a huge amount of stuff in C-17s and C-130s to bases, established bases, and operating for, you know, several days at a time, because their concept, A, gives them that sustainment, which we could never afford, and that scale. And B, their concept assumes that in the event their bases are being attacked, there'll be large-scale reinforcement coming across from the continental United States quite soon, which again, we can't necessarily count on. And on the other hand, the RAF is looking at the Finns and the Swedes who do dispersal brilliantly. But the problem with that is you have to build your air force from scratch to do that if you're going to do it properly. You can't retrofit that meaningfully into an air force that wasn't built for it. Not least because our aircraft aren't designed to be supportable on the ground in that sort of way. Everything from, you know, basic maintenance and ground support equipment through to mission data and how it's dealt with. So yeah, I think a bit of air defense and passive hardening is actually probably more effective. The language you're right does need to change.
Yeah, no, I'm mindful of the time. There's a couple of other areas I'd like to quickly canter through. One of which is our nuclear deterrent, minimum credible. It wasn't that long ago that we had an air-launched nuclear capability, euphemistically styled tactical nuclear capability, but we took that out of service. Russia still has some sort of tactic. Do you think there's merit, at least in principle, of having some form of graduated nuclear capability potentially on air platforms?
I think there is certainly strategic purpose to it, and it is very notable how suddenly helpful the French air-launched nuclear deterrent looks in the new world we find ourselves in Europe. What I would say as a caution is, firstly, as those who have any sight on the budget breakdowns within that the SDR is having to grapple with, know just the minimum nuclear deterrent that we maintain with the submarine-based deterrent is phenomenally expensive. I mean, unbelievably expensive to do. Because, unlike what people often think, it is genuinely independent for everything except the missile body, which comes from a common pool. But, you know, weapon, warhead, links, submarine, everything is all UK developed, which is very, very expensive to do. And for an air-delivered option, we used to have WE-177, which but was a free-fall nuclear bomb, which in today's world is not really particularly credible. In the same way as Paveway 4 isn't particularly credible. The French air-launched nuclear deterrent is a multi-supersonic, low RCS, decently ranged standoff nuclear missile launched from a Rafale that has a very, very good self-defense electronic warfare suite, operates as part of dedicated forces with their own tankers, their own air defense, their own procedures that regularly practice this stuff, right up to including simulated launch with full mission rehearsal on all parts. and they have the redundant, buried, hardened command and control to support it credibly. That's an enormous amount of investment. I'm very glad they made it, but I just think it's important to be fairly clear-eyed about what a credible air-delivered nuclear deterrent looks like in today's world against today's threats. Because most of the arguments I see for putting essentially trying to get a British air-launched nuclear weapon quickly revolve around basically trying to piggyback on the existing nuclear dual-capable aircraft agreement within NATO for B-61 Mod 12, which is again a free fall, in this case GPS-guided bomb, for F-35A. Now, there's two issues with that. First of all, it's a free-fall nuclear bomb, so it's not hugely easy to deliver. You would need a vast amount of enablement to ensure getting it through, and you really would want to ensure that every weapon you assign got through in that scenario, because if you're playing with air-delivered effects, you probably are trying to avoid, but are very worried about strategic nuclear exchange at that point. So you don't want to allocate 4 weapons because you think there'll be a roughly 25% chance that one gets through, because the danger is then they all get through and suddenly you've made a completely different step along the escalation ladder to what you expect. At the same time, you don't want to just use one and have it probably shot down on the way in, because that further undermines your position. In other words, there's a delivery credibility problem even for F-35 because it's a freefall bomb. But the second key point, and I think the overwhelming one, particularly in our new context, is that any B-61 Mod 12 will be an American nuclear weapon that will only be releasable to, in this case, if we were to try and get into it, British forces, or the same for any other DCA nation, under express authorization from the US president in wartime. Which means that if you follow through it, what that would mean is that the US president, particularly this one, would have to have made the decision that the situation was so grave that it merited the use of an American nuclear weapon, and then in that same thought process have decided, but I won't have it delivered by US forces, which are massively more able to deliver it, massively more able to assure it, and have much more control from a presidential point of view. Instead, I'm going to delegate it to a third-party ally who is much less credible at delivering it, almost certainly, and gives much less reflexive control, reflexive or direct control. So I just don't see it as a utility, a useful weapon. I understand its political significance over time, but given how much it would cost, and given the states that our armed forces are in, particularly vis lethality, and the need to invest in weapon stockpiles of all kinds yesterday from anywhere we can buy them, it's not where I would look immediately for uplift.
And so, if I can tell, where might you look? I mean, you've also written about novel weapons, where technology may take us. I appreciate there's a Pandora's box there. We don't have much time, but where do you see the greatest hope for sort of next generation capability coming from the world of technology?
I think there's a huge amount of both capability potential and also risk that we need to buy out in the electronic warfare space, or electromagnetic warfare space. Actually, you should have a paper coming out about this in 19th of March via RUSI. Essentially, electromagnetic warfare is one of the areas where AI or machine learning enabled techniques are most easily applicable for transformative effects, because the fundamental questions that you're asking are quite simple. What has changed? How has it changed? Pick out stuff in this mass of data, and the data set is gigantic. AI is generally brilliant at answering relatively simple questions in an enormously complicated data set relative to humans. Where it tends to fall down is when you ask it anything subjective or where the question itself is complicated. And so for EW, given how much time and energy it typically took to trawl through huge amounts of intercepts to identify where enemy systems have changed or are using new waveforms or a new war mode or whatever that we haven't seen before, AI can massively improve the capacity of the limited number of suitably qualified and experienced people that you can put on those kind of tasks. And I think given our limitations on weapons, even assuming we do all the right things now of trying to expand production capacity, ordering whatever we can in terms of both traditional and non-traditional kinetic weapons, we will need both our own electronic attack capabilities to help stand in terms of on UAVs and things, and also stand off from platforms to help get those weapons through to target. And also, we will need to have an ability to keep up with the fact that Russian threat systems, both electronic warfare systems and radars, because partly of the selection pressure they've been under in Ukraine for the last 3.5 years, are much, much, much more agile than they used to be. They change frequency, they change patterns all the time. So just for maintaining our existing defensive systems on our current platforms and weapons, for example, we will need to uplift the way, we will need to refocus and provide the resource to bring in those AI-enabled tools into places like the Joint Electronic Warfare Operations Support Center, the JOSC, where a lot of this good work is done. And then in terms of weapons, I mean, we need a mix. We need the ability to leverage that great work that's been done by Ukraine, but also by UK companies and other European companies supporting Ukraine to produce large numbers of relatively cheap one-way attack or loitering systems for decoy one-way attack purposes or even standard EW, at the same time as buying as many of the complex weapons as we possibly can. Things like Spear EW for standard EA off F-35 and hopefully Typhoon as well, to give it some standoff. And, potentially looking at glide bombs as well. So, for example, if we can get a significant order of GBU-39, so the small diameter bomb, just off the shelf from the Americans, it's not a survivable weapon against layered air defenses unless it's going in the context of alongside anti-radiation missiles and swarms of chaff. So, yeah, we need that layered approach. Buying new platforms, though, I just don't think we have time at this stage.
No, and what's fascinating, it makes me chuckle. There's a bit of deja vu. The electronic warfare was something in the Cold War. We were constantly investing, constantly upgraded. We dropped the ball. We now need, it's philosophically something very different. I guess my final point is in an ideal world, we'd have all of this stuff, but vision without funding is hallucination. My final question to you is, there's a lot of debate about 2.3, 2.5, 3%, 4%, Donald Trump, 5%. I suspect there's two questions actually here, one of which is, how much do we think is required? And secondly, how on earth do we address the big gaps, capability gaps that have emerged from the last 35 years? I'm not asking you to give a war and peace, but where do you sense the answer to these questions lies?
I think the fundamental requirement to solving any of these problems is to much more tightly bound the answer to the question of what do we want our armed forces to do? Because fundamentally, there are two reasons we got into the mess we're currently in that are not inadequate funding. Yes, the funding probably should have been higher, but frankly, for example, Finland maintains a perfectly credible defensive posture, much more so than its size would suggest it should, against Russia, and it spends about the same as we do on defense as a proportion of GDP, but they do almost nothing else other than prepare to fight the Russians. So this idea that it's impossible to field credible forces within the sort of GDP amounts we spend is just not true. We could do it. The two reasons we don't are, firstly, that we spent 25 years sacrificing blood and treasure and wearing out our forces and adapting our forces away from a focus on warfighting to answer the call of the one time Article 5 has ever actually been triggered, which was by the United States after 9/11. And we basically wore out and changed our forces to fight their wars alongside them as good allies for 25 years. So it's a bit rich for them to then turn around and go, why don't you have any capability? You Europeans waste all this money, you don't spend enough on defense. So part of that is because we lost credibility on the military politically. We wore out our forces and we pivoted away from warfighting to help you guys fight your wars for 25 years as good allies. The second point is that we consistently, particularly in the UK, insist on trying to maintain full spectrum forces, i.e. forces that can do a bit of everything, when the funding and personnel available are just manifestly inadequate to do so. And so what that has led to is every single year, pretty much for the last 20 years, funding has been significantly less and personnel significantly less than are required. So every year they have to try and find some little fix, push something out of year, find a little hedge, trim a little bit of, efficiency, which actually, as you alluded to correctly, means taking away all your resiliency, all of your enablement, and leaving you with hollow forces. And we've been doing it for so long, and all the chickens have kind of come home to roost now as we suddenly face this crisis, and everybody looks at the forces and goes, oh my God, it's all hollow. And it's like, well, yeah, because you consistently underfunded it for so long. So I think the unpalatable truth is going to be for the government that they are going to have to sell to the electorate, although frankly that shouldn't be that difficult. They should, I think, be a little bit more bullish than they are, given that they have 4 years to an election and a massive majority. So frankly, public opinion doesn't matter a huge amount right now, as long as they might make the decisions that in retrospect were correct when we come to an election in 4 years' time. That they're going to have to sell to the public. We're going to have to raise taxes because thanks to some of the decisions made by one of the last governments, our ability to borrow in an unfunded way just isn't there in terms of what it does to bond markets and interest rates and mortgages and all of that. So they're going to have to raise taxes and probably find cuts elsewhere to spend more on defense. And at the same time, we're going to have to cut large areas of big politically significant capability, because the bill to make even the force we have now, that is not particularly well suited to high-end warfighting against the Russians, because of all of that time in counterinsurgency and frankly the Navy's obsession with going to the Indo-Pacific on periodic deployments, which now probably isn't the main focus. To just make that force credible in any sort of significant conflict against the Russians would take an enormous increase in GDP spending to fill in all the munitions, sustainment, personnel, training, and all of those gaps. And then you add in that the Americans are doing what they're doing currently, which means that suddenly we don't just have to make the current force credible and hopefully pivot it to something better suited to Russia. We have to try and work with our European partners to fill in all sorts of gaps where only the Americans have traditionally added in capability. Airborne electronic warfare being a really good example. So even if the government does what I think it absolutely has to do, which is significantly raise defense spending and not just in 5 years' time, it is still going to have to cut significant bits of the force. One example, and to avoid being parochial, given I'm an air focus guy, I'll just look at the RAF side of things. One example is, we need to get past, and we as a defense commentariat, as well as the MOD and the government, need to get past what the reaction was when we cut C-130. And everybody went up in arms. Cuts at a time of national defense, and how dare they? And this is an irreparable loss of capability. No, sorry. What else do you expect them to cut if you're trying to reintroduce teeth into the frontline combat focus side of it? We have a force which, for very good reasons, in the air side of things, was completely disproportionately invested into fixed wing and rotary lift and permissive fixed wing ISR at the expense of combat aircraft to support enduring deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. Entirely the right moves at the time. However, it is not therefore valid to say, now that we're desperately having to pivot back to how on earth can we roll back the Russian air defenses and ground-based air defenses to enable ground forces to survive in contact through close air support, to say it's outrageous to cut lift in order to try and invest in putting some meat back on the bones in all the stuff you can't see. You can't have it both ways. And I would suggest that in the RAF's case, it is still a force that has a significantly disproportionate amount of both support helicopter and fixed wing lift compared to combat teeth for a force of its size and funding. If you look back to 2006 even, the RAF had about 460 combat aircraft. And we've now got, what, 160-ish? With almost no munitions for a whole series of mission sets. The balance does need to be readdressed, given that while you will always find incredibly useful stuff to do with lift, always, they're some of the hardest working, most useful bits of the force. If we can roll back Russian air defenses with European allies and hopefully a bit of support with the US to a point where we can re-establish close air support for troops forward, then the Russian army probably can't threaten us with anything where they might convince themselves they can do a fait accompli and not be pushed out. If we can't roll back those air defenses, then I don't see how Europe can be credible in that deterrence picture. And strategic lift or support helicopter is not going to make the difference one way or the other on that. Obviously, we'd love to have both, but what's going to make the difference is SEAD-DIAD, offensive counter-air, and defensive counter-air to maintain your ability to operate from your bases during that. So we should probably focus on that.
I just hope these conversations, as bluntly, are happening behind closed doors. I know, there's a lot of people involved in those conversations with the government and military experts, but it doesn't feel like the conversation we're hearing from the political classes is talking about evolution, not revolution. It feels like a fundamental, once in a generation opportunity to shift our military focus. And it's been absolutely fascinating. I wish we had a bottle of wine and we could have gone through this a lot more detail. Justin, I will call Trump's. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. I'm sure we'll be calling on you again, but an absolute delight to have you on. Thank you for your time.
Take care.